some issues you would like to raise?
Good afternoon, members of the press. Thanks for having me once again. There are a few issues I want to bring to the fore. I want to start by saying that the facts confirm PPP's electoral fraud. We've seen from this process many ballots that were not stamped, and those votes were for the APNU, AFC, and therefore indicative of fraud. Two, we've seen missing oaths of identity. That's a fact. This process has confirmed that. We've seen in this process APNU, AFC ballots found in PPP envelopes. Again, this is a fact that has been confirmed by this process. We've seen missing certificates of employment. This is another fact that has been confirmed by this process. We've seen more voters than are ticked on the list, a fact that has been confirmed by this process. In some ballot boxes, more votes than on the list, another fact. We have pointed out up to 699 ballot boxes, 284 polling books were missing, facts, not speculation. Broken seals, anybody who's there, and you can ask the small parties, they are there. It's a fact that there are many broken seals. We've also contended and provided information that many persons outside of the jurisdiction voted. I want to point out to you that we have sent a first batch of 600 such information to GCOM, and we reliably informed that immigration has confirmed more than 90% of them that were ticked, according to their records, are out of the jurisdiction. We have also sent those for that died, and we are waiting on confirmation. Having said that, I want to draw your attention to what is happening in District 9. In District 9, we've seen a preponderance of people who voted without ID, but there is no oath of identity. In box 9040 at Tapatinga Nursery, 18 persons voted no ID, no oath of identification. In the same Tabatinga Nursery, another group of 18 voted no ID, no oath of identification. At Culvert City, before I go there, Tapatinga Sports Complex, 11 persons voted without ID and without oath of identification. So what we've seen here is that in two close buildings, with a few ballot boxes, more than 50 people voted who should not have voted. To me, that is a fact of fraud. And all of this can be found in the observation report. Many of you are in contact with the small parties. You can ask them if it is not true that this is coming out in the report. What I give you there is just a sample of what happened in Region 9 in one or two areas. I don't have the time to go through it, but for those of you paying careful attention, today, one of the hallmarks of today is a lot of persons in Region 9, which the PPP won, have voted without ID and without oath of identity. That points to fraud. We want to point out in Region 7, a region which we won. But in many of the areas where the PPP won, we want to point out to you what happened. Box 7077, we have 2 oaths of ID that should have been there, not there. 724, 50 counterfoils missing. In that same box, 724, 16 oath of identity missing. 7029, 17 oaths of identity recorded in poll book, no forms to establish that they were signed and actually voted with it. 7019, 2 extra ballot found over and above the number. 7010, 17 oath of identity missing. 7017, 12 oath of identity missing. 7021, no oath, no certificate of employment found. 7055, 12 oaths of identity missing. In a mere 9 boxes, you're talking about 119 people who voted without identification or without an oath of identity. If this does not constitute fraud, I don't know what will. What we're saying here is that essentially, when you look at what is happening in regions 7, 9, and 8, the trend continues. And the specific characteristics of these far-flung areas is a lot of people voting without oath of identity, without an ID card, and that constitutes fraud. So I want to close by saying that we have presented to you factual information that comes straight from the recount for your consideration. Thank you.
Mr. Norton, just for clarification, you were saying that the AP and AFC would have submitted 600 names of persons who have migrated but are alleged to have voted. That's the case, or that's a mixture of persons who with that certificate?
We're talking specifically this 600 about people who have migrated. Well, I won't say migrated, who were out of the jurisdiction and voted at the time. Migration has a different connotation.
Where are you going to send in the other 600?
It's very difficult for me to say to you when we'll send it. We'll go in it, looking at the various regions and send it. And once we put together all the information, we will send it.
There are many things that you mentioned that came out of the recount. Missing poll books and so on that are procedural irregularities. But how do you go from, let's say a missing poll book, for instance, is a evidence of fraud?
Well, to call it a procedural whatever is really not to understand the nature of it. If you voted without an ID, or you voted without an ID and you did not sign an oath of identity, you have committed electoral fraud. That is not a simple irregularity. The law says that you can vote if you don't have an ID. But the presiding officer is expected to question you. Look at the picture in the folio. Confirm that is you. And once they confirm it is you, you then sign an oath of identity acknowledging that you were that person there and therefore entitled to vote. If you did neither of the two, you committed a fraud.
Mr. Norton, what action is your party expecting because you mentioned that 90% of the persons out of jurisdiction, they were confirmed not being in the jurisdiction as voting. What actions, your party is expecting from the commission?
We expect the commission will look at the facts, and we expect the commission in doing its report will take the appropriate action. I don't know it is for us to decide what the commission will do. We have established an act that is illegal, They say he who asserts must prove. We're providing the evidence to prove. It is GCOM's task to act.
Okay, one party or one stakeholder would have said that if an intent is shown, right, on the voter's ballot, right, that it should be counted in favor of that party that intent is for. And they're claiming that, okay, if this belongs to us, it must be us. So in those cases, right, while GCOM is to decide what are your party's desires.
You are comparing eggs and mangoes. When you talk about a vote that is intended, here is a ballot. If the person put the XA outside of the box, but it is in line with the AP and UAFC, then it should be the vote. You can determine that. But that is not the issue at hand. Unfortunately, the issue we're talking about is as an issue in which people should not have voted because they didn't have ID and they didn't swear to an oath of identity. You have cases where there were no certificate of employment, so you can't prove that they were. So it is not solely a case of who gets the ballots. And that is why I said earlier, in early interviews, this is both quantitative and qualitative. Quantitatively, in terms of those where you know the vote was going, you can deal with it. But you have these qualitative problems which affect the very fabric of the electoral process. And many of them cannot be rectified by looking at a ballot and giving it to somebody. So what it does is that it strikes at the fabric of this question of credibility. What that will establish is that many of the votes aren't credible. But to move down the line to say it should be given to X or to be given to Y is not an issue I think can be resolved easily.
What has been happening in the counting stations with those specific or those cases or those number of votes, are all the ballots in that ballot box or those specific ballot box with those anomalies being counted?
The decision was all will be counted, but that at the end of the counting, the observation would be made in the report. And that is being done. And if you check the observation report, you will see all of this documented. So what GCOM has at its disposal is the counting agents pointing out that this has happened and therefore it needs to be investigated. It is GCOM's role now to investigate. Though some are now suggesting, having suggested earlier, that GCOM had the authority to do all this. I saw one PPP person who was going on before this process started about GCOM having the authority to do it, now saying that GCOM doesn't have the authority. It is the usual moving of the goalposts. Thank you for having me.